and the Dragon's Teeth. One day, long ago, the 4 children of King Argonauts of Phoenicia were at play together in a meadow by the sea. They were the brothers Cadmus, Phoenix, and Celix, and their little sister, Europa. On this particular day, a splendid butterfly appeared, and the brothers set off in pursuit of it.
It looks like a flower with wings.
Europa, a bit tired, sat back among the flowers and closed her eyes. And when she opened them again, she saw before her a beautiful snow-white bull. Where had it come from? At first she was frightened, but it was so gentle and playful that she soon forgot how big and strong it was, and offered it blades of grass from her own hand. And when it lay down, she took the flower garlands from her own neck and hung them on its neck, and wound them around the great bull's horns. It also seemed to want her to ride on its broad back. Why not, thought Europa, leaping nimbly onto it. Suddenly the bull gave a great leap in the air, almost throwing Europa to the ground. Then it rushed madly straight toward the sea. Europa called in vain for her brothers.
Cadmus, Celix, Phoenix.
By the time the boys reached the shore, the bull's snowy head could hardly be seen in the white-capped billows, and Europa seemed swallowed up by the wide blue sea. Cadmus, Phoenix, and Celix went sorrowfully home to tell their father that a white bull had carried off their sister and swam with her over the sea. King Argonauts was beside himself with grief for his favorite child. He cried out,
"Begone! Enter my presence no more until you come leading my little Europa by the hand."
Queen Telephassa embraced her sons and said, "Alas, my dear children, if I should lose you too, as well as my little Europa, what would become of me?" Then the queen, taking her 3 sons by the hand, and accompanied by their friend Theseus, set off on a quest for Europa, a quest which turned out to be a great deal longer than they dreamed. They went here, there, and everywhere, traveling a long way, passing over mountains and rivers, and sailing over seas. Always, they asked if any person could tell them what had become of Europa. The good people would pause in their labors and look very much surprised, but nobody had seen a little girl dressed like a princess and mounted on a snow-white bull. Their own princely robes grew tattered and torn, and they exchanged them for the clothes that ordinary people wore. Indeed, they soon looked more like a gypsy family than a queen and 3 princes and a young nobleman. The years followed one another in this fashion until the boys were quite grown up and had sprouted soft new beards. One after another, they grew weary of this never-ending quest, with never a place to sit down a while and no place to call their home. At length they said to each other, "It is such a dreary time since we lost little Europa. We have all forgotten how she looked. Indeed, if we were to find her, she would now be a woman grown, and would look upon us as strangers." Soon after, the young men dropped out one by one. They each found themselves pleasant spots in which to build habitations, and in the place where each one stopped, a city grew up. Finally, the quest was left to Queen Telephassa and Cadmus. One morning, the queen, who had grown weaker and weaker, called Cadmus to her side. "My son, my pilgrimage is over. You must make me a grave here and lay my weary frame into it. But do not grieve for me. If my little Europa is indeed dead, I shall soon be joyfully reunited with her. If she is still here, perhaps the oracle at Delphi can tell you where and how to find her." Cadmus grieved that his mother should be taken from him, but after performing his last sorrowful duty, he set out on the road for the famous oracle of Delphi, as his mother had instructed. He knelt above the mysterious hole on the famous mountainside and asked, "Sacred oracle of Delphi, whither shall I go next in quest of my sister Europa?" A rushing of air came from the hole and seemed to form the words, "Seek her no more, seek her no more, seek her no more." "What then shall I do?" cried Cadmus.
Follow the cow, follow the cow, follow the cow. Where the stray cow lies down, there is your home.
Cadmus turned away and thought himself no wiser than when he came. He cared little what might happen to him, so he took the first path that offered itself and walked along it in sorrow and dejection. After a time he beheld a brindled cow. She had been lying down by the wayside, but when she caught sight of Cadmus, she got leisurely to her feet and began to move along ahead of him. Presently it occurred to Cadmus that this might be the cow foretold to him by the oracle. "Hey, Brindle, hey!" called Cadmus. "Stop, my good cow!" He wanted to come up next to her to see if she looked different from any other cow. Still the cow trudged on, whisking her tail, but always keeping just ahead of Cadmus. If he walked slowly, so did the brindled cow. If he quickened his pace, the cow went so much the faster. Cadmus decided that this must indeed be a magical cow. So whenever they reached a particularly pleasant spot, he looked around eagerly to see if the situation would suit him for a home. But whether he liked the place or not, the brindled cow never offered to lie down. The cow did seem to be magical, for by now many people were bewitched into following along. They made quite a crowd, and they followed the brindled cow even over rocks and through mud and mire. Cadmus was glad to have people to talk with, and he told them of his adventures as they trudged along. Finally, one day, one of the company cried, "Joy, joy! Brindle is going to lie down!" And sure enough, the brindled cow was slowly reclining herself on the soft grass. "This, then, is to be my home," Cadmus said, gazing around him. It was a fertile and lovely plain with great trees flinging their sun-speckled shadows over it, and hills fencing it in from the rough weather. At no great distance, they beheld a river gleaming in the sunshine. All the companions were just as pleased as Cadmus, and set off immediately to find a spring of water to quench their thirst. But his new friends had not long been gone when Cadmus was startled by shouts, cries, and screams, and the noise of a terrible struggle, and in the midst of it all, a most terrible hissing, which went right through his ears like a rough saw. Running towards the spring, he beheld the head and fiery eyes of an immense dragon, with the widest jaws ever, and many rows of horribly sharp teeth. Before Cadmus could reach the spot, this pitiless dragon had killed his companions, and was busily devouring them. Drawing his sword, Cadmus rushed at the monster and flung himself right into its cavernous mouth. Thus, though the struggle was a tremendous one, and though the dragon shattered the tuft of trees into small splinters with the thrashing of its tail, Cadmus was all the while slashing at its very vitals. The brave Cadmus gave a sword thrust that finished the battle, and creeping out of the gateway of the dragon's jaws, beheld that the creature was dead. But Cadmus was sorrowful to think of the fate of his companions. It seemed as if he were doomed to lose everybody whom he loved. And here he was, after all his toils and troubles, in a solitary place, with not a single human being to help him build a hut. "What shall I do?" he cried aloud.
"Cadmus," said a voice, "Cadmus, pluck out the dragon's teeth and plant them in the earth."
With great effort, Cadmus drew out the dragon's teeth, using his sword, until one by one he had a bushel or so. Then he planted them in the ground, even though it seemed a foolish thing to do. Quite out of breath, he had waited for a few moments when he began to see a sight which was a great marvel. In the dark soil he thought he saw something glisten very brightly in one spot, and then another, and then another. A vast number of bright sword blades and spearheads thrust themselves up everywhere like so many stalks of grain. A moment afterwards, a multitude of polished brass helmets came up like a crop of enormous beans. So rapidly did they grow that Cadmus discerned the fierce countenance of a man beneath every one. He beheld an abundant harvest of what looked like human beings, armed with helmets and breastplates, shields, swords, and spears. "Cadmus," said the same voice he had heard before, "throw a stone into the midst of the armed men." So Cadmus seized a large stone, and flinging it into the middle of the earth army, saw it strike a gigantic and fierce-looking warrior. Immediately the warrior uplifted his weapon and smote his neighbor, and stretched him on the ground. In an instant the warriors began to strike at one another with their swords and stab with their spears, while the trumpeters blew their blast shriller and shriller. The battle continued to rage without cause, until out of the thousands, only 5 were left standing. "Cadmus," said the voice again, "bid those 5 warriors sheathe their swords. They will help you build the city." Cadmus stepped forward with the aspect of a king and spoke in a stern and commanding voice. "Sheathe your weapons!" Feeling themselves bound to obey him, the 5 remaining sons of the Dragon's Teeth stood before Cadmus in a rank, eyeing him as soldiers eye their captain, while awaiting the word of command. It was strange to observe how the earth, out of which they had so lately grown, was encrusted here and there on their breastplates, and even begrimed their faces, just as you may have seen it clinging to beets and carrots. "Come," said Cadmus, "you are sturdy fellows. Make yourselves useful. Quarry some stones with those great swords of yours, and help me to build a city." They set to work in good earnest, and toiled so diligently that, in a very short time, a city began to make its appearance. But the palace of Cadmus was not erected until the very last minute, because they meant to introduce all the new improvements of architecture and make it stately and beautiful. On the morning when Cadmus went to the site where the palace was to be built, followed by his 5 sturdy workmen, he saw a most wondrous sight. A magnificent palace had grown up overnight out of the earth. As King Cadmus gazed through the courtyard of the palace, he beheld a wonderfully beautiful woman, adorned with a royal robe and a crown of diamonds. His heart thrilled with delight, and he cried out, "Europa!" "No, Cadmus," said the same voice which had spoken to him in the field of the dragon. "I am not your dear sister. I am Harmonia, daughter of the sky, and I will replace your sister, mother, brothers, and boyhood friend." So King Cadmus dwelt in the palace with his new friend, Harmonia. Before many years went by, they were joined by a group of boisterous children. And some say Harmonia invented the alphabet for them, so that stories such as this one might never be forgotten.